you just give it to me in terms of numbers, that's not meaningful. But if you tell me we've got a car traveling at this speed and what's going to happen when it hits a wall at this velocity, now it's like, okay, I can picture that in my head. And then the math is self-evident after that. If you try to apply this model to something that lasts for 10 seconds, it's not going to work. It's going to vastly overestimate what you can do. So you got to use the right tool for the right purpose. We use anaerobic because in the 20s, somebody cut a frog in half with a pair of scissors and put it in a jar and sucked out the oxygen and kept shocking the legs until they stopped twitching. And then said, oh, look, there's a lot of lactate. This must be the result of anaerobic metabolism. If you are a track athlete and you are running the 800 or the mile or something, yeah, you have to do you have to do a fair amount of running. But a lot of that has to be really fast running, right? Because you need to be able to go really fast. I don't expect every athlete to be an expert in exercise physiology. But they can understand in broad terms most of the big concepts. And what I've found is when I really clearly describe and explain things to athletes, it's only helpful because they buy into the program. You're going to do so much better if your wife likes you and your kids see you, because they're going to want to come to your races, right? And they're going to make signs for you, and it's going to be a family thing. If this is only about you getting out for your 6-hour ride on a Sunday and then falling asleep on the couch and not spending any time with your kids or your wife, your family relationships are going to suffer and your performance is going to suffer in the long term.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms, hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in the water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps, and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movements based on what the data is showing you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, you can better target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their programming, training, and in turn, their performance. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch, and you can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a tool I've used weekly for over a year now with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon code UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. All right, Phil, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Hey, thanks for having me, Sean.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I got acquainted with your work through one of the Moxy summits, one of the presentations. I think it was 2018.
Oh, yeah.
You had a nice presentation on the Breaking 2 projects and everything that went into it. And I found the way that you told the story was great. And then found you later on Twitter. And I thought, hey, I need to get you on the show to talk about everything that you do. So maybe for the few people that don't know who you are, what you do, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I hail from Chicago, Illinois at the moment. I run, I'm the director of sports medicine for AdvocateAurora, which is one of the 5 largest medical systems in the United States, or something ridiculous like that. I run the Human Performance Lab, as well as the sports medicine training program for trainee doctors. But the other part of my job is I do a lot of work in coaching and consulting, primarily for elite endurance athletes, but certainly for a lot of other sports as well. Which is a lot of fun, and those two things kind of play off of each other nicely. Because some people, find me because they're looking for a sports doctor, and and my goal as a coach has always been to put myself out of work as a doctor, which I think patients kind of appreciate. So it's
a good way to frame it. Did you started on the medical side or on the sports side?
I started on the sports side. I was never a great athlete or anything like that, as I often tell people, but I was a swim coach in the late 90s, which I really enjoyed. And then as I came into the 2000s and as I came through medical school and got involved in endurance sports, I was terrible at it. I trained with guys who, were former professional athletes and things, or current professional athletes, guys in my class, and they were destroying me. And I was like, there's got to be an easier way to do this. And so my physiology professor, Bill Sexton, said, I talked to him and he was like, Skiba, there's better ways to do this, and kind of turned me on to XPhys and some of the literature and some of the, in particular, the mathematical modeling, which I took to right away.
Mhm.
I'm much better at math than I am at sports. And so, yeah, and it was just, I developed a number of different mathematical ways of analyzing training. And of course, no one's more surprised than me at how well they work. Because next thing I know, I'm training these elite athletes and they're winning world championships. And sometimes I'm just thinking, like looking at myself, like, what are you even doing? Like, how did you manage this?
Did
And
you
then,
did you always have a knack for numbers, for mathematical models before you merged that into
I,
the
I, I
sports
always,
field?
I always enjoyed it. It's funny because in grade school and even most of high school, I never knew I was very good at math because I didn't have very good teachers, to be honest, in terms of math. And then as a senior in high school, I had a great math teacher. And so, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, I can do this. And then when I got to college, I was a little bit fearful because my calculus, I had to take, in the US, you have to take a year of calculus if you want to be a science major. And I was like, oh, this is not going to be good. But my teacher taught it from the perspective of physics,
Yeah.
moving bodies and orbits and things like that. And that makes it concepts make intuitive sense to me.
It's kind of applied math. So it's going from
Correct.
kind of the applied setting, and then you just kind of reverse engineer the numbers behind it.
Correct. And once you put it that way, then all of a sudden, when you just give it to me in terms of numbers, that's not meaningful. But if you tell me we've got a car traveling at this speed and what's going to happen when it hits a wall at this velocity, now it's like, okay, I can picture that in my head. And then the math is self-evident after that because you understand how the physical system works.
Was there a specific moment, concept, framework that kind of clicked for you, and you figured that you could do this, and this was maybe something you wanted to explore more down the road?
Yeah, well, my background actually for most of my life, I've studied music. And in particular, not just the performance end, but the recording end of it. And in fact, before I got into medical school, I ran a small recording studio for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And the math that governs the way the body responds to exercise is precisely the same math that you use to define a digital reverb, for example, or echoes.
Could you explain that a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, so if you the example I always use is you bounce a basketball in an empty gym. Well, the bounce is your training, the initial impact that you hear. And the echo that you hear in the room is the response of your body.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a nice way of picturing it. So the louder I hit the ball, the louder the echo in the room is, But you also know, for example, from a concert, that if you crank the volume up too loud, the echo becomes overpowering and you can't hear anything and nothing sounds good anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of analogy works very well when I try to explain to athletes like why we train this hard and not harder, or this much and not more.
Is there does the analogy or the model hold if we push that train of thought into the environment and how far the walls are and maybe what the materials are made of in terms of the repercussions of different kinds of training on a different
precisely,
set?
right? Everyone's got a different size room. Everyone's room is made out of different materials. You can strengthen the materials, for example. There's lots of different ways you can think about it, and I think that helps people because when you put it in front of them in terms of just kind of cold math or a graph or something, they don't get that. But when you explain to them in terms of things that they experience in everyday life, then that makes a lot more sense. It's like Einstein said about time being relative, right? Where he says, if you touch a hot stove, that second feels like forever,
Yeah.
But if you sit down on a bench next to a pretty girl, that hour goes by in a second, right? And again, it's just easy for people to kind of you have to think laterally because not everyone has the experience that you do. And that's the biggest trick of coaching, right? Is getting people to understand, to communicate with people in a way that's meaningful to them.
Do you remember the first time you started applying mathematical models to performance?
Yeah, it was using the critical power model. Because I was going to do my first 5K, and I had never really run that far before on purpose. When
Only by accident.
Well, there was a girl I liked in high school who was on the track team, and on the Jersey Shore, where my family had a beach house. Occasionally her family had a place a couple towns up, and she'd come running by, where she and some other girls from the team would run by occasionally. And so I had a friend who was an elite soccer player who was an alternate for the Olympic team, and she was like, "Skiba, we're going to train you up so you can run with this girl," And so she would just run me up and down the boardwalk and and kick my ass, you know. And so I occasionally got above 5K by accident as Lori Pels was trying to kill me, but it was a lot of fun.
Could you describe the critical power model for those who are maybe not fully familiar with it?
Yeah. You know, the idea is that as you try to go longer, the speed with which you can do it gets slower. Okay, but it's not a linear relationship. You know, for example, most healthy people can probably run 100 meters in 20 seconds, right? But almost no one can do it in 10 seconds, right? So there's a big drop between how fast you can do a really, really fast, really, very short thing and something that's even slightly longer. And it's kind of a curve that comes down. And eventually that curve levels out. And so back in the good old days, the first guy to figure this out, A.V. Hill and those guys, and what they did was pretty simple. They just started plotting out the world records at different sports, at different distances. And they saw it looked like a ramp from 100 to 200 to 400 to a mile and so on. And they said, oh, there must be some kind of physiological process that governs this. And mathematics were first figured out in the 50s by Monod and Scherer, who said, oh yeah, look, we can fit a curve to this. And there appears to be some place where that curve levels out. And that's threshold. Every athlete knows that, right? You go out and run. I can run a little bit faster. It's okay. I can run a little bit faster. It's okay. And all of a sudden you get to that point where you say, if I try to go any faster, something bad's going to happen. I'm going to have to quit, or I'm going to throw up in the bushes or something. That's the critical power. That's the critical speed.
Would you be able to detail for us maybe the differences or the similarities between the critical power value, let's call it, and then other representations of thresholds that are used, like maybe FTP is one of them in cycling. There's the respiratory compensation point on the ventilatory side. There's the MLSS maybe on the lactate side. So where do all of those sit for you relative to critical power?
Yeah, I get into the book. I spend most of a whole chapter discussing threshold, right? And there's two thresholds you want to keep in mind, the important ones anyway. You've got what we call, the first ventilatory threshold, okay, or the first or lactate threshold, okay, or the gas exchange threshold, and that basically happens at the point where lactate first starts to rise in the blood. And there's different ways of saying what that is, but the easy one from Ed Coyle in the 80s is it rises by 1 millimole per liter. And, that's something somewhere probably between your half marathon and marathon pace. Okay. You don't even, when you're in the neighborhood, but it's not an extraordinary amount of work. The second threshold is a little bit more difficult because there's lots of different ways of looking at it. For my money, critical power is the best because it's a performance measurement. We measure a couple of points, we calculate this curve, and I know where that happens. And importantly, physiology changes appreciably there. Above that point, you start trending to VO2 max, right? Maximum oxygen uptake, even if you don't speed up anymore. If you run the same pace, if you're above the critical speed, you're going to hit VO2 max. If you look inside the muscles, pH is dropping, inorganic phosphate is rising, like lots of things that indicate fatigue are happening and quickly in the muscle and in a precisely calculable way. Then you have these other representations of threshold. The functional threshold power is a common one. The problem with FTP is that it's not a bona fide physiological threshold. It doesn't mean it's not useful, right? If you want to say that, yeah, we want to gauge our effort to how well we can do something for an hour, okay, I don't have a problem with that. But what you see is there's a number of papers that have come out showing that the FTP can be considerably different from lactate threshold or from critical power or from these different things. And that's what makes it problematic. So for my money, I like critical power because it has a set way to calculate it. We're going to do it this way. We always get the same numbers, and it's pinned to physiology. And then you've got your respiratory compensation point and all these other kinds of things that require some expensive gas analysis equipment to figure out. And they diverge from critical speed or critical power depending on training status. So at the end of the day, I just feel like let's use the one that's easy to calculate.
Do you feel like there's or from your experience and with the type of athletes that you're working with, what's your favorite way, or what's, in your opinion, the most accurate way of determining critical power? There's the 3-minute all-out test. There's going to be a few different max efforts on set times or distances, and then there's going to be time to task failure at set speeds or power outages, or power outputs. Is there a best one in your opinion?
Well, it depends on where you are. For example, in our lab in Exeter, the 3-minute all-out test was easy to use. You have to have the right ergometer. You have to have that ergometer set up the right way. But if the people are reasonably experienced with doing it, you can knock out a test very quickly. And our laboratory and all the students there, because all of them were subjects in all of our studies, we had a lot of people that knew how to do this. They come in, they could crush themselves, we get numbers. When you're dealing with inexperienced people, for example, in my laboratory here in the US, where every couple of years, I have different house officers who I'm going to abuse. They're not necessarily comfortable with it. Some of them are not even athletes. They don't understand how to give a full effort. So for those people, it's easier to do time to task failure, because I just set up the ergometer and I tell them, ride as long as you can. When your cadence drops by 5 RPMs, we stop the test. In the field, I think a max effort is best. Run as hard as you can for a mile, run a 5K as hard as you can, like that, and collect some data that way.
What is the field of applicability of the critical power model? Where can it help us and where can it maybe not, or where does it fall off and we can't maybe trust those estimations or calculations anymore?
Yeah, so one of the challenges of the critical power model, well, one of the challenges of the understanding of the critical power model, because what we have is a lot of literature out there written by people who don't really understand it, or a lot of people criticizing on the internet that don't get it, right? The critical power model in the 1950s was defined as something, critical power is something you can do for a long time, right? And they didn't really worry about when you got tired. It was just like, at some point, this model doesn't really fit anymore. We know that the model fits from about 1.5 to 2 minutes out to maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes. On the real outset, occasionally you get a monster who can hang on in that vicinity for maybe an hour. But that's honestly very, very rare. I know 2 or 3 athletes in the world that I've seen able to do that. So you need to be looking at a really narrow period of time. And it describes physiology, and it describes time to fatigue very well in that time. If you try to apply this model to something that lasts for 10 seconds, it's not going to work. It's going to vastly overestimate what you can do. And the same if you try to apply it to someone that takes 2 or 3 hours, it's also going to vastly overestimate what you can do. So you got to use the right tool for the right purpose.
So in that case, how did the critical power model fit into the Breaking 2 project, where we are dealing with a 2-hour effort?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, what you're worried about with critical power is where you're going from stable to unstable physiology. So, and when you look at these athletes, it's not an easy question to answer, because their critical power, their VO2 max, their lactate threshold are all like this far apart. Just 20 or 30 seconds spread between all those different values. So what we want to do is nail down where it is, because we know that if you go harder than that, things are going to go wrong. So what you're using is the critical power as a ceiling, saying, I know you feel great. I know you're well tapered. I know we trained the heck out of you. If you do more than this, it's going to end badly for you. And I frequently have that, that talk with athletes. I call it the come to Jesus talk. And if you look in the book, I give examples, real world examples from athletes. Like I use my W prime balance model, which gives you the sort of allows you to plot out exercise wise how much time you can do before you have to quit doing any interval protocol. And so I write a workout on that basis. I do this, and they get to the 3rd interval and they say, man, I feel great. I'm going to go harder. And then they punk out and they don't finish the workout. So then I have the come to Jesus talk. I say, we tried it your way. Now let's try it my way, and it's very useful from a teaching perspective in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about W prime here. So that's the second parameter that's part of the critical power model.
Yeah.
What does it represent in your own words, let's say?
Nobody knows what it represents, is the funny part. So if you can imagine this curve in your brain, above that critical power, right, there is an area under the curve. Okay, we call it the W prime. But the easiest way to conceptualize it is as a battery. Okay. If you go above critical power or critical speed, you have a limited amount of energy available before you're going to have to quit and throw up in the bushes. And you can use that short, real quick by running as hard as you can over a couple of minutes, or you can take a longer time to empty the battery over the course of a 5K. But in either case, all the energy you have available is what's in the battery. That battery, it recharges if you drop below critical speed or critical power, and you deplete it if you go above critical power. And if you ever end up at 0, you're in trouble. And so that's the way to think about it. But the actual physiology is complicated, We know from my work, it's very much related to the rise in VO2. From my MRI work, we know that it's very related to the decline in creatine phosphate in the muscle.
Mhm.
But it's probably related to lots of stuff. Because you know, reductionist thinking only gets you so far. There's lots of things going on in the body, and it's all happening at once. And no institutional review board is going to give me permission to do the kinds of things you would have to do to a human to figure it out. So.
Yeah, so that, like you said, it touches on many different things, and oxygen is one of the important parts of
Yes.
because I mean, the first time I heard it, it's like your anaerobic kind of battery,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But it turns out if you mess around with oxygen supply, you're going to mess up W prime and critical power as well. So they have a relationship, but it's not quite clear how those interact, correct?
No, it's not. And that's the interesting thing about it. But one of the reasons I like that data is that it helps drive home to people that we should stop using the terms aerobic and anaerobic, right? I mean, we use anaerobic because in the 20s, somebody cut a frog in half with a pair of scissors and put it in a jar and sucked out the oxygen and kept shocking the legs until they stopped twitching. And then said, oh, look, there's a lot of lactate. This must be the result of anaerobic metabolism, right? And ever since we've been talking about anaerobic, but clearly you need oxygen. And clearly you can be using a lot of oxygen and make a lot of lactate at the same time.
Right.
So it's like, yeah, like this is not an anaerobic work capacity. It's best termed just the amount of energy you have above threshold.
Yeah, and so you talked about replenishing that battery, refilling the tank, let's say, when you pass below that critical power threshold. How can we conceptualize this? Because I'm sure it's not or from what I understand, it's not a linear relationship, as in if you spend 30 seconds above, 10 watts above your threshold, you're going to deplete it from that many joules. We can calculate that quite easily. But then the reverse is not necessarily true once you get under. So how did you come to work out how this balance works?
Yeah, so I mean, the math is complicated. It's like a differential equation is the best way to conceptualize it. We're not going to do that here.
Thank you.
Right. The easiest way to imagine it, right, is you've got a bathtub, and the bathtub has a drain in it, and it's filled by a faucet, right? And if I open up the tap really, really wide, the tub's gonna fill, right? But if I just open it up a little bit, or if I have a really big drain, the tub's gonna empty all over the place, right? So those are your two extremes. The way it turns out is that the tub fills faster the farther below critical speed you go. So for example, like you do an interval, you run really, really hard, you empty half the tank. If you walk, the tank refills faster than if you jog.
Mm.
And it refills faster if you jog than if you run just below threshold.
Mm.
Okay. So it's all about recovering as hard as you exercise, because you got to get that tank to refill. And this is the dangerous part about sport, right? Like one of the examples I use in the book is Kat Morrison from the 2010 World Championship duathlon in Edinburgh. It was over Arthur's Seat, which is this huge climb in the middle of the city. And so we had trained on that climb a bunch of times to see how much energy can we deplete and how quickly will it recover on the downside to balance the terms of that race, so that we didn't get into big trouble. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the graph, you can see she took it right to the edge, and which is how she got the lead she needed to win the race. Despite the fact that she even got a 30-second penalty, she still won the race. Mm. And a lot of it had to do with her ability to pace that in kind of the proper way. So that's really why it's important in performance, because once you empty, it takes a long time to recover. The fastest athletes I've measured can get back about half in 100 or 150 seconds. So just imagine,
which is very fast.
Right. And that's really fast, and just think about what would happen to you if I forced you to walk for 90 seconds in the middle of a race, in the middle of a 10K, right? You'd be the last one in, in a world championship race. Mm. So that's why it's so important to not empty the tank, to understand the kinetics of how this tank empties and refills.
If we tie that in now to perception, have you seen great athletes that are able to kind of know when they're really close to being on empty, and to what extent can using those models help athletes better understand themselves and, like you said, in pacing and in race settings?
That's the goal, is really to help people understand themselves better on a bike, we have these models, like people have built my model in Garmin. So you can use it in real time on the bike. You can see how empty the tank is. And my friend Robbie Ventura here, who used to ride for US Postal, he has got a gym in my town here. He runs whole classes based upon that model.
Mhm.
He sets up the intervals and people watch it on the screen, and it's cool. But I think it's harder in like running, for example, because of the accuracy of GPS and the speeds you record and things. So really, it's more important in those cases to help use the math to train the athlete. You see how you feel now? That's about 10% left in the tank. Things are going to go wrong here quick. Don't do that. And so other examples I give in the book are a very good age group triathlete I used to train, who was nice enough to donate his files for the cause. And so we analyzed his training from a race where he crushed the bike. He was accelerating out of corners and crushing the climbs and stuff, and it just didn't go. He had nothing left for the run. So like 2 weeks later, we ran this model. We said, yeah, you're racing next weekend. Keep your power under this. Don't surge above this. And he came into T2 with about half the battery left. And he ran like crazy, and he had a great race. So once he understood the way these different kinds of efforts feel and what it meant for his physiology, he was able to leverage that information. And that's my job, is giving you actionable intelligence, right? That's why Breaking Two hired me. It's like, I can give you this actionable intelligence that will help you do things better.
What should we not try to do with those mathematical models?
You got to remember that the model is a representation of the physiology, right? It doesn't define it, so in the same way that physics, kind of help you understand a system, but don't define the system. And the best example of that, really is Joanna Zeiger, who I trained for several years. She won the 2008 half Ironman World Championships and set a world record. And so I had models. I knew she was going to win. Like there was no doubt about that in our minds. The question was by how much. And despite our models, which were very, very high quality, she ran, I forget exactly what it was, but I think 90 or 100 seconds faster than we even predicted. Because I remember we were sitting by the finish line with her father, and we're looking at the landmarks on the screen as she's coming in, and he's looking at his watch, and he's like, she's not supposed to run this fast. And I'm like, no. And then we pretty quickly figured out this is going to be a world record. And then we're like jumping up and down, like, oh my God, But it taught me the limits of these models, right? Because, something that fits in one setting in training or even lesser races, like the motivation of this athlete, like she was going to get this and no one was going to take it away from her. And you just saw her come in that way, just and just crushing it right to the finish line. And it was like, yeah, these models, like, they don't define anything. They give you the ballpark. It's up to the athlete to execute.
Yeah, that's really interesting going into as well. The impact of just the brain and perception and what athletes can do when they, maybe push beyond what was on the paper or what was supposed to happen, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. Models are best used to inform, not to limit. Because people talk a lot about psychology and the central governor and all these other kind of nebulous things. But the best way to think about it is that the brain has veto power. The brain can always say no. But we've all had a workout. We just didn't have it in us that day. Your mind was elsewhere. You couldn't do it, and yeah, that's life. But depending on it, can't just make you do anything either. There are physical limits. There are mechanical limits to the structures in your body. So not anything is possible if you believe it. And so modeling helps us kind of cross that river and figure out where the truth is.
We talked about critical power as maybe the second threshold, and you also talked about the importance of knowing that first threshold, and that kind of depicts the training intensity distribution, or what zones or what domains we're going to be training in. Can you explain the importance of the moderate intensity domain, or the zone 2, or the low intensity work for endurance athletes, the place that it takes?
Yeah, so you got to remember that there's something called the Hahnemann size principle, which tells us about what kind of muscle fibers are going to fire when. And Peter Krustrup over in Denmark, when he was a PhD student, did some incredible work in this field, looking at different domains and how can we figure out which muscle fibers are firing when, and how does that relate to oxygen uptake. So if we're in that moderate domain, if we're below lactate threshold, if we're below half marathon pace or something, what's going on there is that your oxygen use rises and it kind of levels out, and it stays there for a good long time. And that's because you're primarily firing type 1 muscle fibers, the slow twitch fibers. They have lots of mitochondria. They're very fatigue resistant, but they're not particularly strong. And so your goal in this long training is training the fatigue resistance of those fibers, because they got to carry you a long way. Because what happens is that as you go longer, those fibers fatigue, and you start recruiting higher order muscle fibers, fibers that are stronger, but are not necessarily as endurance oriented. And those fibers begin to tire. So you recruit the next higher group of fibers, which are even stronger, but are even less fatigue resistant, right? So you have this cascade until you run out of muscle fibers and you punk out. Mm. So your goal of training in that low intensity zone is to train those fibers, the type 1 fibers, to let them hold out as long as they possibly can. And so you can maintain that level of exercise for a long period. But you need to do your interval exercise because you need to specifically train those higher order fibers, and so on. And then you need to be able to cross over, So one of the favorite workouts, people often talk about, you shouldn't be in the quote unquote gray zone. That would be great, except the most successful athletes that I know and that I have trained spend a lot of time in the gray zone, quote unquote, in that moderate domain, somewhere below critical power, but somewhere above the lactate threshold. And the Kenyans are a great example of this. When Elliot and his guys go out for their long run, maybe 20, 22 miles like that, they're starting out at a pace that you and I could sit with them. They run at 8:30 pace. It's really easy for them. I mean, it's killing me, but I can do it. But by the time they're at mile 15, they're running 5-minute pace, and then they're running 4:30 pace, right? So they're going into those higher zones, those higher domains, towards the end of exercise. The idea being that we've already pre-fatigued this kind of slow twitch pool, and now we got to be able to activate these other guys, and we're going to have, this is going to be a proportional harder training status because we're doing it later on fatigued legs, or a higher training impact. Let's put it that way.
That maybe brings us to the conversation of, polarized versus threshold training. So when, why, and for whom?
Well, a lot depends upon the event that you're doing, right? And Trent Stellingworth and I were kicking this around on Twitter the other day. It's that you need nuance in this conversation. It's not, everyone should be polarized, whatever that means to you, or everyone should be threshold based or whatever. No. If you are a track athlete and you are running the 800 or the mile or something, yeah, you have to do you have to do a fair amount of running, but a lot of that has to be really fast running, right? Because you need to be able to go really fast. So for track athletes, it makes, or for middle distance runners, it makes more sense maybe to be a little bit more polarized. It's more specific to what they do. But if you're a marathon runner and I have you run only easy and then only have you do intervals, and then we spend the 6 or 8 weeks or 10 weeks before your marathon just doing 400s, that's getting really badly for you, because you need to be able to run at somewhere between those two paces. And if you never do it, you're not going to know what that feels like. You're not going to know how to pace yourself. So I just wish that, we live in an era when people want to define themselves and want to stake out a claim on something, and people want views and clicks and whatever. And people have short attention spans. Tell me how to win the Olympic marathon in 160 characters or less, and it can't be done. We need to have a more nuanced conversation than that.
For longer events such as the marathon, is there a time in the season where a more polarized structure might apply or might be beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, a lot. So for example, when I'm training athletes for things like marathons or iron triathlon or iron distance triathlons, what I'm typically doing is what is thought of as quote unquote reverse periodization. You're not reversing anything, right? You're just going from general to specific.
Yeah.
That's the main rule of periodization. Go from general to specific. So for these people, yeah, they're doing some easy running, some long running. Yeah, they're doing some really, really hard running, right? Because we're trying to kind of touch on all the physiological systems. And then in the middle of the season, right, critical power is hugely important. So we're going to spend a lot of time doing threshold running, doing 800 repeats, 1K repeats, mile repeats. And then in that last block, that 6 or 8 weeks before, 10 weeks before the marathon, we're going to switch back over. We're going to keep doing some threshold running, and we're going to keep doing some interval running, but we're going to do a lot more running closer to marathon pace, a couple K repeats at marathon pace and so on at the end of a long run, for example. And then right before, you kind of polarize again, right? You drop the bottom out of the training, you reduce volume, but you maintain intensity. So it looks a little bit more polarized again. And then you race, but that period is just a couple of weeks. It's not months at a time. And that works very, very well. And that looks very different from someone for say a track athlete who comes to me, where we might be doing more of the longer stuff early, a lot of threshold and VO2 stuff sort of in the middle, and then really leaning on the intervals and VO2 stuff as we come into the race, to the big race. But it just makes sense in that way. You're going from general to specific, and it doesn't need to be more complicated than that.
How much impact does the low intensity work have, or how much does it support the high intensity work? What importance does it have there?
No, I mean considerably, because again, you have to train all the muscle fibers because you're using the whole leg as you're going down the track, right? So these sports, if you're going longer than 100 or 200, aerobic metabolism has a huge part to play, right? Quote unquote aerobic metabolism has a huge part to play in anything you're doing. If you look at track cyclists, they ride thousands and thousands of miles easy in addition to their track workouts, right? They're not just on the track all the time. Like it's all required.
There's a good example of that the training that just came out of, is it Niels van der Poel that just did the 5 and the 10K world records and a double medal, if I'm not mistaken. And very kind of him to kind of show everything that he did. Some pretty incredible volume of training in the I think it was 3 months, but it was 8-9 months away from the Olympics. So it was kind of, would we call that his base phase?
Sure.
And we were looking at 30 plus 35 hours per week of very low intensity training on a bike from what I saw. How much does, you talked about this before, general into specific. Do you feel that nowadays athletes in general are inclined to do too much specific work too early and maybe neglect some general prep?
It really depends on the sport that you're talking about. This is particularly with respect to age. This is a huge problem in the United States. We have people trying to professionalize sport from a very young age. And a lot of that has to do with the financial rewards that some professional athletes get, or the fact that university is so expensive in the US. So everyone thinks their kid's going to get a scholarship. And so what you see are kids playing on these travel soccer teams and things from age 6, 7, 8 years old. And they're coming in with injuries that I used to see only in professionals. And their bodies are not prepared for this, And if you look at like David Epstein's work, for example, like what you see are that the people that are most successful later in life are the people that were multi-sport sport athletes early on. So like there is something to the general, just in life, preparatory phase, right? And then as you come into your later career, the things need to become more and more specific and more kind of honed down. But even when you think about things like strength training, it's very difficult to show a positive impact of strength training on endurance exercise, with certain exceptions. You look at things, for example, like plyometric exercise. There's some good work now showing that helps runners. But in the general case, if you're looking at just regular weight room stuff, it's very difficult to show that there's any positive benefit to endurance performance. That being said, as a doctor, the people who I see get hurt much more frequently are the people that don't do any strength training. People that do some work in the gym in addition to their running, I see them much less frequently. Now, can I say that that's anecdotal? That's an anecdote. That's not data. The plural of anecdote is not evidence. But am I confident enough in seeing this over and over and over again in my clinic that spend 20 minutes or 30 minutes 3 times a week, lifting weights. It's not going to hurt, and it might help. It's a little bit of cheap insurance, maybe.
Cheap insurance is a good way to put it. If we talk about nutrition for a second, I've heard you talk about the importance of carbohydrates, especially for high performance and high level athletes. Is there a place, in your opinion, for high fat approaches at some times of the year, for some events, for some athletes?
I mean, Louise Burke likes to talk about how you should be metabolically flexible because we know for 100 years now that if I feed you a lot of fat, you're going to burn a lot of fat. If I feed you a lot of carbohydrate, you're going to burn a lot of carbohydrate. And both are important for a number of different reasons, right? And if you look at great athletes, you look at the Kenyans, for example, like they're doing their long runs basically fasted. They didn't eat overnight. They have a little tea or something. Maybe they go out and run and they have a big breakfast afterwards. And if you look at Louise Burke's data, it shows that if you do some of that nutritional periodization, maybe you limit carbohydrates at certain times before long runs and things like that. In sub-elite athletes, you reap some benefits. In elite athletes, you see less or none. And that's probably because those elite athletes are always slightly carb depleted because they're always training, right? But carbohydrate, but if you look for benefits to performance by using a high fat, low carb approach, you're going to be looking for a long time because that data doesn't exist. And I'm constantly seeing athletes in the clinic who have developed an orthorexia, right? They've bought into some system of nutrition. This is the right way to do it. And I always ask them the same question. Are you faster or are you not faster? And invariably, well, no, I'm not as fast, but I haven't adapted long enough, or there's always an excuse. And it's like, your job is to win races. Why don't we eat the way we ate when you were winning races? and, and it's just not more complicated than that. I think everyone, again, we have a situation where people are trying to get internet famous. So I'm going to put up this really extreme diet. I'm going to show you how ripped I am and whatever. And okay, that's great. Can you win a marathon? I mean, I take care of a great multiple state champion cyclist who switched to a high fat approach and all of a sudden fell right off the podium, fell out of the top 10, then fell out of the top 20. He's saying, oh, I feel so much better though. I'm like, I'm glad you feel better. And if that's your goal, do your thing. If you want to win races, this is not going to work for you, So
if you had to share beyond the conversation of the fats versus carbohydrates, which, like you said, maybe shouldn't even be a conversation, or at least not in such a cut and dry manner, what are the fundamentals for you of nutrition for endurance performance?
So most athletes, if you're training a lot, you need a lot of carbs. And by a lot, I mean greater than 60 to 70% of your daily calories are going to have to come from carbs. Now, if you're not training a lot today, like don't eat 9 pounds of pasta, be reasonable. But I usually just have athletes split their plate up into quadrants. And if you're training real hard today, at least 2 of those those quadrants need to be carbohydrate, and the other 2 you can split up between greens and proteins. And then we can move those proportions around on the plate depending on what the training is like. If we're in the winter, if we're more in a strength focus, drop the carbs down 10-20% and increase your protein, for example. There's nothing wrong with that. And it helps them feel a little bit less bloated. It helps them, so there's a lot of different balls you've got in the air with respect to diet. But I think an overcomplicated approach, it leads to bad outcomes. Especially we've noticed during the pandemic, when people have been at home with nothing to do with themselves but obsess. In our clinic, the rates of eating disorders, particularly in young women, we saw in high school and college age women go up by 70 or 80%.
That much?
Yeah, it was unbelievable the number of people we saw developing problems with their diet. And we had to intervene with relatively quickly.
What kind of interventions is there at that level?
So number one, it's having a sit down with the athlete. And when I start, I always start from the element of performance. People have lots of different reasons for trying to eat a certain way. I want to look a certain way. I want to do whatever. With an athlete, I found it's most productive to usually start with performance, which is that, what's your goal? Do you want to go fast? If you want to go fast, this approach is not going to work for you in the long term. This is totally antithetical to your goals. And a lot of people you can reel back in that way, because it's not that they have developed a bona fide eating disorder. It's that they have just developed an unhealthy way of eating. You can bring those people back. The people that you can't bring back, you try to get early psychological intervention to kind of help them with that, because eating disorders are really no joke. And a lot of young people get involved in sport almost as a mask for the eating disorder, right? Because now I can do a lot of exercise. I'm expected to do a lot of exercise. I can burn a lot of calories. and that helps me keep my weight down.
Mm-hmm.
And I have people like that as well who really didn't necessarily have a great desire to be an athlete in the first place, but it became part of the whole constellation of their symptoms with their eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And as a clinician, that's something I really have to keep my eye on.
Do you see those issues that you mentioned related to the current situation? Do you see those still popping up? Are they still as prevalent, or do you feel like they're subsiding a little bit?
It's definitely still out there, but again, the numbers have started coming back down because I think people are out a little bit more. Teams are training again together. It's not people at home for months at a time locked up in their houses. So in that sense, it's a little bit beneficial, I think. Yeah.
I guess for me, that speaks to the importance of our environment, of the frame that we put ourselves into when it comes to training. What do you do with the athletes that you work with to optimize that environment? What's outside the training? What's going on around in their lives, so that they can perform as best as they can and be the best athletes that they can?
It's everything in life is about being well-rounded and having the right team around you. And what I really try to drive home with that to athletes is that, no one does anything alone. You're standing on the shoulders of giants, and those people are your support structure. And nowhere do I see this more than the work I do with Dare to Try, which is a Chicago-based nonprofit that helps people who've suffered some kind of catastrophic injury or disability to get back into sports. Mm-hmm. So people who've lost a limb, wounded warriors and things, we get them their first bladed running leg. Or their first hand cycle or something like that. And when you see the way that the whole family gets behind this, right? In terms of whose dad is wrenching the bike for them and whose mom is packing their nutrition bag and whatever, it's really just so heartening to see. And I try to bring that vibe to other athletes, and I tell them these stories, and I'm like, if you want to succeed, it's not a one-person show. Like, you got to do this, and particularly when you deal with age group athletes in triathlon, for example, as they get older, I tell these people, you're going to do so much better if your wife likes you and your kids see you, because they're going to want to come to your races, right? And they're going to make signs for you, and it's going to be a family thing. If this is only about you getting out for your 6-hour ride on a Sunday and then falling asleep on the couch and not spending any time with your kids or your wife, your family relationships are going to suffer, and your performance is going to suffer in the long term. So, if you can develop a balanced lifestyle around sport, it's not just to sort of your psychological advantage. It's a legitimate performance advantage, and take advantage of it.
It's probably understated the importance of family in sports performance.
Yeah. I mean, you see all these, there's a reason why you see all these Olympians in tears when they're showing the Skype of their family back home cheering for them, right? Mm-hmm. That's who they're performing for. Like, these athletes, no one's ever going to know most of, can you name the curling team? I can't, right? So who you're really doing this for, right? You're doing this for your support structure. You're doing this for your friends and family at home that want to see you do great. Mm-hmm. So, leverage that.
Yeah, I love that point. So you have a competent coach, you have a supportive family. For someone who really wants to take their performance to the next level, what other members of their team do they need to find? Do they need a good physio? Do they need a nutritionist? Where would you go beyond that kind of close circle? And then, like we said, a competent coach, maybe strength and conditioning coach, etc.
Yeah. So you can't overstate the importance of good strength and conditioning, number one, because there's a lot of people in the world that got a weekend course in personal training and think they're a strength and conditioning coach. And I see people, particularly out of some of these big, organizations or gyms that promote quote unquote high intensity interval training, doing lifts that are just frankly dangerous if you don't have, a really high level strength and conditioning specialist showing you how to do it right. Mm-hmm. You cannot go from being a couch potato doing clean and jerks in a week. It's just not safe. So I think that's important, as people, is having someone that's not just has some strange credential, but actually legitimately knows what they're doing and has been in the game. Same thing in physio. I know dozens of physios that would be capable of taking care of you well if you had a knee replacement. I can count on one hand the number of physios I know that are capable of taking care of an elite athlete.
Right.
You know, you got to know who those people are, and you got to be willing to ask. You know, what are your qualifications? Within the realms of privacy, can you tell me who you worked with? What organizations do you have you worked with? What teams do you cover? You know, because you want to develop this picture of what this person's background and experience is. Same thing with nutrition. In the United States, anyone can call themselves a nutritionist. There is no legal definition of that term. I could go out tomorrow and say, I'm a nutritionist, come to me, I'm going to make your diet plan. You need someone who's in the United States who's a registered dietitian, and then hopefully with an additional qualification in sports nutrition. And there's a few of them in Chicago, for example, but they're not always easy to find, because you would not believe the number of people I see, you know, even at local gyms calling themselves nutritionists and giving people frankly absurd diet plans. It's like there's, you know, and they're invariably low carbohydrate. You know, why? Because carbohydrate in your muscle brings water into your muscle, which increases water weight. If I tell you eat 50% less carbs, you lose 20 pounds in the first week or two. And now you feel, wow, look at this, look at these results. This person's a great nutritionist, you know? And so that's all part of it. And it's like, you have to know enough to be able to make a good decision about, you know, does this person know what they're doing, or does this person not know what they're doing? That's not always easy to figure out.
Do you feel like usually athletes know enough to be able to, like you said, find the right people to work with them?
I think athletes almost never know enough. And so what I would tell athletes is, the people who are going to know are not even necessarily your colleagues or your friends. Find a good sports doctor, you know, someone like me who does a lot of work in high level sport, and ask them, who should I go see? Who's trustworthy? And that's your safest bet, because we do the legwork to figure out who's good, because our professional reputations and indeed our licenses depend on it. We get in big trouble if I send you to some lunatic. So it's up to me to know who's good. So ask me.
Absolutely. You said the athletes almost never know enough. To me, that what came to mind is that it almost goes against the idea, or does it? I don't know. That's a question for you, maybe. Does it go against the idea that, oh, we shouldn't share too much information with our athletes? Obviously, in the coaching realm, I can understand we don't want to overload them with unnecessary information. They need to perform, and this, we should give them kind of the minimum to do that. But to what extent can we just educate them and help them to better understand themselves and to develop as an athlete and as a person?
You know, I think we underestimate athletes. You know, I don't expect every athlete to be an expert in exercise physiology, but they can understand in broad terms most of the big concepts. And what I've found is when I really clearly describe and explain things to athletes, it's only helpful because they buy into the program. You know, it's no accident that most of the, like, for example, some of the best women I've trained are all women with advanced degrees. You know, Joanna Zeiger and Kat Morrison and Ruth Brennan Morey. These are all people with master's or doctoral educations. And when you explain something to them, now they believe it. Now they buy into it. Right? Now I get why this works. Yeah, I'm going to do this, you know, and that's an important psychological edge. You know, because the weakest coach-athlete relationship is the one in which you say, do it because I said so. That's absurd. And infantilizes the athlete. And you know, my goal as a coach, I've always told people, my goal as a coach is that you don't need me someday, right? That I can teach you enough that you can do most of this on your own. And like an external opinion is always important. But I think in general, coaches overstate their own importance. You know, I'm there to get you that last 5 or 10%. I'm there really to keep you from getting hurt. You have the superior physiology already. You already have what you need to be a champion. My goal is to keep you out of your own way. And that's it. You know?
Yeah, that's well stated. One thing that came to mind when you said you want to, or that's a quote that I heard. I forget where it came from, but you want to train your athletes / clients so that they don't need you, but you want to treat them so that they never want to leave.
Exactly, and it's a perfect way to put it.
I thought that was a good quote. Again, I'm sorry, I don't remember who that came from. Phil, I want to talk about your new book that just came out last month, I believe.
Yeah, here you go, book plug.
Please do. It's
blurred.
It's blurred by Zoom.
It's called Scientific Training for Endurance Athletes.
Why did you write it?
You know, I'd written a couple of books relatedly in the 2000s because I was appalled at the lack of good information out there, science, evidence-based information for athletes. And so both of those were like 100, 110 page books. And the idea was that I'm just going to teach you the basics, right? Here's what VO2 max is. Here's why it's important. Here's how you train it. Here's lactate threshold. Here's why that's important. Here's how you train it. And here's how you can design. Here's a framework for you to be able to understand when these things are important. And again, I was pleasantly surprised at how successful they were, because both of those books, my company published them. Because when I went to some of the big publishing houses, kind of the terms of the contracts were absurd. Like, I'm not going to write a book with hundreds of references so that you can give me 10 cents a copy. And fortunately, I had the resources available to me to have it professionally designed and professionally printed and all that kind of stuff. So they look just like the stuff you buy from Human Kinetics or anything you see at Barnes and Noble. And so the response to them was really good. People just bought it off my website. I sold thousands and thousands of copies. And so I was like, wow. So then I decided after all these years that I needed to update, because these books were now 20 years old, one of them, and one of them was, like 15 years old. So over the pandemic, I said, all right, I'm finally going to finish this book, because I'd planned to do it for years to update, but then breaking two and running around the world and all this other stuff, it just kept getting put on the back burner. So the pandemic gave me the opportunity to say, okay, let's update it. Let's put all my new research in there. Let's put all the new stuff in there that Sprague and Burnley and Jones and everyone's been Van Haddel, everyone's been doing. Like, let's update all this for the modern era. And it was fun. But what was interesting is that when I went back out, because now I have a reputation, now I can kind of demand a better contract from a publisher. I went back out there, and at least one of them was like, well, this isn't good because it like you spend a lot of time myth busting, but that's gonna not be beneficial to our other titles. So we're gonna be selling against ourselves. And I kind of scratched my head. So I said, they kind of pulled the contract, and I'm like, do you honestly want me to sell against you instead of you just collecting the revenue on both ends? I said, okay, So I did just what I did last time, and did the same thing and put it on Amazon. And like my house now looks like like an Amazon warehouse, because I get hundreds of books coming in every week, and I sell through them immediately. And then I'm shipped, and so I'm waiting for the truck to come. My neighbors are looking at me like I'm insane. They're like, why do these tractor trailers keep pulling up to your house? What are you doing in there?
That's pretty awesome. What part of the book or what chapter are you most excited about?
I spend a lot of time in there discussing these ideas of thresholds that we talked about earlier. Because once you understand that relationship between what happens to your physiology, what parts of your muscles are you recruiting with different kinds of exercise, the way to train becomes self-evident, right? You don't need some guru to tell you. You don't need some like magic program you bought on the internet. It becomes obvious how to do it. And that's what I like, is that if you follow the physiology, 95% of training becomes obvious. And that's the goal, is that it's not easy, or it's not hard, it's easy. The work is hard. The work is very hard. But like I say on the back cover, right? The secret is there is no secret. Like, if you follow these rules, you're going to perform well. And anyone can do it. And that's my goal.
That's fantastic. Where can people find your book, Phil?
You can find it on Amazon if you're in the US. Unfortunately, to put it on Amazon abroad, I would need to open a European company and then pay taxes in Europe. And I honestly, I'm a doctor. I don't have time for that. So, so if you go to my website, people in Europe and the rest of the world can buy it online there by using PayPal, and I ship. Just the important thing is, for you people in the rest of the world, it takes a long time to get to the rest of the world because of the pandemic. I've seen it get to Germany and the Netherlands in as quick as a week. I've seen it get to Italy and Spain in 6 weeks, or even close to even longer than that, maybe, because some of them still haven't arrived. Okay. So please be patient. I'd love to give you the book, but I can't control how fast the post office works. All
right. So now everybody's informed, and just be patient when you order your book. Phil, it was a lot of fun having you on the podcast. I appreciate your time and sharing your expertise. Where can people connect with you online if they wish to do so?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter is usually the easiest, at Dr. Philip Skiba. You can also email me, coachphil@physprime.com. I try to get through my email, but there's a lot of it, so it's hard sometimes. Don't be offended. Twitter is sometimes easiest because it's so quick, and you can't ask me 19 questions, so it's it's a quicker communication.
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Sean. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.